Creo
Adela-
empezamos a grabar y arrancas tú, ¿cierto?
Perfecto, sí. Perfecto, bueno, buenos días para todos. Bienvenidos al Café de la Liga de Directores y al lanzamiento de nuestro programa de la Liga para el 2022. Encantados de tenerlos aquí. Nuestro saludo va a ser en español, después vamos a cambiar a inglés para darle la bienvenida a nuestra invitada, a nuestros invitados, a Judy, Samuelson y a Bernardo Vargas. Digamos que vamos a dar una apertura que la va a dar la decana Beneta Andonova. Para quienes quieran tener interpretación simultánea, como ven en sus pantallas, hay un icono abajo que dice interpretación y ahí pueden escoger el canal que prefieran para el idioma en el que quieran oír la conversación. Bueno, encantados de tenerlos. Como todas las reuniones de la Liga de Directores, esto lo conducimos bajo las reglas de Chatham House. Entonces, todo lo que conversamos aquí se mantiene, digamos, aquí su atribución, las preguntas, las respuestas, pero la idea es que aquí creemos conocimiento que sea útil para, digamos, otros grupos también interesados en temas de gobierno corporativo. Estaremos teniendo esta grabación como parte de la información de la Liga de Directores, o sea que sí será, digamos, parte del material de la Liga de Directores de este año. Con eso les doy la bienvenida a todos y le doy la palabra a Beneta.
Muchas gracias, Eulalia. Para mí es un placer hacer este evento. Buenos días a todos y todas en primer lugar, y el nombre de Kearney Executive Education y el Centro de Gobierno Corporativo de la Facultad de Administración de la Universidad de los Andes, queremos darles la bienvenida al lanzamiento de esta Liga de Directores 2022. Y en este café de la Liga llamado Propósito Empresarial y las nuevas reglas de los negocios. El día de hoy tenemos tres momentos principales durante el evento. Primero, Judy Samuelson, nuestra invitada especial, tendrá una intervención de aproximadamente 40 minutos. Luego, Eulalia moderará la conversación entre Judy y Bernardo Vargas, presidente del Grupo ISA. Y finalmente, todos nosotros tenemos un espacio abierto para las preguntas que quisiéramos hacer a los dos invitados. Antes de darle la palabra a Judy, nosotros queremos comentarles que la Liga de Directores se ha transformado para el año 2022 y hoy en su lanzamiento queremos anticipar algunos temas y momentos relevantes para los próximos meses. El eje central será liderando la transformación hacia un propósito superior, con el fin de generar conversaciones en torno al ASG y cómo caminar desde las juntas directivas hacia este propósito. Tendremos dos grandes momentos y cada uno de ellos va a ser con 2 días de encuentro y participación, y el primer momento será en abril y el segundo en agosto el próximo año. Con el fin también de retomar la presencialidad que en la Universidad de los Andes estamos liderando desde el sector educativo. En nuestra liga se está planteando momentos virtuales y otros presenciales con la posibilidad de sesiones híbridas bajo metodologías que van a permitir la participación y la experiencia óptima de todos, no importa bajo qué formato se van a unir a los eventos. Así que hoy queremos que enciendan los motores a nosotros para empezar a conversar sobre este relevante tema de propósito superior empresarial. Esta sesión cuenta con una traducción en simultánea, entonces ese es el momento en el cual todos vamos a elegir el idioma en el cual vamos a tener la oportunidad de inspirarnos con la experiencia y las palabras de Judy, a quien ahora quisiera presentar. Ella es fundadora y directora ejecutiva del programa de Sociedad y Negocios del Instituto Aspen y autora del libro 6 New Rules of Business, Creating Real Value in a Changing World. Los programas corporativos bajo el liderazgo de Judy incluyen una campaña de 10 años para interrumpir la narrativa de Milton Friedman sobre el propósito corporativo, el diálogo profundo para definir los principios de Aspen sobre la creación de valor a largo plazo y la asociación con Korn Ferry para repensar los salarios de los ejecutivos. Sin más demora, cedo este espacio ahora a nuestra invitada especial, Judy Samuelson. Judy, the floor is yours.
There we go. How's that? Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this morning, and to Vanessa and Yulele and to the whole team here that's put this program together. I'm honored to be a part of it. I come with full disclosure that I work and have always worked in the United States, and my knowledge of your country is it's just an impression from having been there once. I've certainly traveled a fair amount to Mexico and a little bit to Latin America, but I'm speaking to, I hope, some questions that will still resonate, and I'm very eager for the conversation to engage with Bernardo, who knows both of our countries well, and will also help kind of, I think, not literally, but figuratively translate some of these questions. But I do hope that I can learn today as well from you and understand what parts of these questions that we're asking about the role of corporations resonate. And I know that the role of boards and the role of board members and the changes that are afoot there are of great interest to all of us. We think this is a remarkable moment in which we're seeing a lot of change in boards, and we expect to see much more so. So without further ado, let me see if I can get through the 3 quick steps to share the screen here. And that's what I didn't want to do. I wanted to find a button that is very hard to find at the bottom of my screen. One more step. There we go. So if somebody would give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen. All right, terrific. So let me just start by saying that this is a snapshot of the Aspen Institute's campus in Aspen, Colorado. It is a beautiful place. I hope some of you have had an opportunity to visit the Aspen Institute, which my program is a part of the Aspen Institute's many programs. The Aspen Institute was founded in just at the middle of the last century. It was founded at the kind of during a period, an interregnum after 2 world wars, in which both business leaders and leaders from other parts of society, but principally the head of a Chicago-based corporation called the American Container Corporation, Walter Pepke was his name, and he and his wife had bought real estate in Aspen, Colorado, and which at that point was essentially a dead mining town. After the silver bust, the town fell into hard times, and they saw this as maybe a kind of an oasis or a place for retreat to kind of step back and think about what do we need to do differently to engage differently for the back half of the 20th century. What might it take? And they took the opportunity to invite people from business, but also people from the arts, from science, from literature, to come and convene in this beautiful meadow, just steps away from what we're seeing in this picture, and have a conversation. And that took place for several years, and the Institute now has many offerings, but it is still dedicated to dialogue around specific problems and around questions of consequence around the health of democracy and of the planet. Our work at the Aspen Institute is about the role of corporations. And we are not in Aspen, Colorado. We work out of New York in this city that you see here on the screen. Our work at the Business and Society program, which I lead, is really grounded in a very simple belief that business is, if not important in the sense of a value judgment, but are simply the most influential and consequential institutions of our day. That doesn't mean that government doesn't have a critically important role to play, but in our country, business influences government as well. And so we start with the belief that we need business at the table to tap the extraordinary talent and resources and the global reach and distribution systems. The basic problem-solving capabilities of business are needed to solve our most complex problems. And we also believe that we're witnessing a change in the will of business executives to step into the fray and think about these questions. The challenges we face, however, increasingly require some fresh ideas and fresh thinking, and they require the collective aspirations of business to step beyond thinking about the health of the individual enterprise and to essentially step into the commons and understand the role that business has to play and what needs to be true for business to be creating long-term value for society. These goals and aspirations, we believe, need to be rooted in science and understanding of planetary limits. And that's why I wrote this book. I wanted to explore what is possible now and to make evident the forces I think are really driving change in the business sector, as well as the barriers that are holding us back. So this takes me back to a story that landed in the New York Times in 1999 and that caught my attention and started me thinking more about the purpose of corporations, the intentions, and the belief that purpose is not so much a statement on a website or in a book, but purpose is actually revealed through the actions of corporations. The story that appeared was about the Royal Caribbean cruise line. The story isn't really here about the Royal Caribbean, and this isn't a picture of a Royal Caribbean boat, but I think it's a foundational story that helps us think about this kind of question of corporate purpose. The company, as the New York Times wrote, is founded in Norway, but is based in Florida. And it had been censored over a period of months and years for dumping toxic waste in the Caribbean Sea in the US coastal waters, thereby endangering the very parts of nature that customers had booked passage to enjoy. Before ships set sail, the waste containment system is inspected. So the dumping of spent fuel was clearly intentional. The dumping lightens fuel costs, lightens the load of the boat, and therefore saves fuel costs. And it also avoids expensive waste containment fees and disposal fees that are paid once you arrive back in port. But it also, of course, endangers the ecosystem and is a clear violation of the public trust. And so the actions for which the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line was censured put both the company's long-term interests and its reputation at risk. So we have to ask, what was the ship's engineer thinking? Why risk tarnishing the brand of the company to save money today? Cutting costs is clearly about securing competitive advantage, but it also asks questions about purpose. It reveals perhaps what the real purpose of the enterprise is. And if we take a closer look at the business model of this ship and many, we see that it's really about profit maximization. And of course, this story isn't about the engineer, it's about the competition. It's about the desire to attract a mass market and cutting costs in order to enable a ship to set sail and take a trip through the Caribbean for as many as 5 nights for as little as $500. And it's about the incentives that are built in and that flow to the engineer, but that are built into the system to assure growth. So again, this story isn't about the Royal Caribbean Cruise Line. It's just a colorful example. But this one might be more familiar to many of you. Remember Dieselgate in 2015, when we learned that the Volkswagen had equipped millions of diesel cars with software that made them appear to operate more cleanly during emission tests. This is a long way from the Small is Beautiful campaign that those of you are old enough to remember that we fell in love with, where I grew up in San Diego, California in the 1960s. And again, it was the engineers, in essence, that paid for the malfeasance. In fact, I recently looked up the story and realized that an engineer who was a German engineer who served 5 years of prison in the United States for the malfeasance was finally released and allowed to go back to Germany to fulfill his term in prison. It was the engineers that paid. It did not float up to the executives. But I think this story, Dieselgate, as well as the cruise line, is really about something that I would call magical thinking. It's the real costs of the product as it's designed are borne elsewhere in order to maximize profits, revenues, growth, or for public companies. And we are very interested in it, particularly at the Business and Society program in the conduct of public companies, in which case it's then about the share price. So I'm going to go deeper into the dark side here before we start to turn the conversation around. But I think we're asking questions at the Business and Society program about value extraction versus value creation. And I want to remind us that this happens across different industries. In technology, we're reading a lot, and there's a lot of conversation and dialogue and inquiry, of course, in the US and Europe and well beyond, about what is the purpose of Facebook. It's clearly, we know what they measure, which is time on screen, which equates to ad revenue. But there's cost to that model, which is essentially built around profit maximization. Or how about Amazon, an example of a retailer that's all about the customer experience. But a single objective function, we like to say, is insufficient to the task of managing an enterprise today. And in fact, I believe that business managers at their heart understand the need to manage across multiple objectives. You can't operate a global enterprise for more than a week without thinking of the costs and the relationships that reside in government, clearly with customers, but also with employees and beyond. How about consumer products? Where's the check on consumer behavior when it reverts to fair wages and pollution and planetary limits? And then, of course, we also ask in the US a lot of questions about capital markets. If a company actually borrows money to repurchase its own shares as a public company in order to hit a target of about 90% of profits distributed to shareholders, then who's really paying the cost of the enterprise? We also ask about enterprises through venture capital and private equity that seem to rebound to short-term measures of success. And yet, of course, we're also seeing real winds of change. Some of you may remember the moment a little over 2 years ago now when the Business Roundtable, which is the trade association in the United States that represents our largest, in some ways, most influential corporations, when after 40 years, they decided to kind of restate how they thought of the purpose of the corporation. We're seeing real changes in the narrative about the purpose of the corporation, in the attitudes and the intentions of business leaders, who I believe have begun to think more intentionally about their relationship with society, and in some respects, put the health of the commons back at the center of the mission, at the purpose of the corporation. And yet it's complicated. And the question I am most typically asked is whether or not these intentions are real. If we're seeing real change in the priorities of public companies in particular. I'm reminded of a executive, Jeff Weiner, who has spoken to we have a number of fellowships and programs where we bring together executives from across different businesses. And he spoke to our fellowship program one year as the CEO of LinkedIn. And he kept on talking about authentic leadership. And I wrote him afterward and I said, what does authentic mean? And he said, it's about keeping your promises. And that's the question I think that the public is now asking of business. Is it keeping its promises? It reminds me, of course, to say that we don't believe that corporations are good or bad. In fact, corporations aren't people at all. They're not moral or immoral. And yet we experience good or bad results based on the design of the business itself. So I think in terms of this headline about CEOs seeking a new purpose for the corporation, I think the jury is still out. And to achieve real, let's call systemic change in how companies are oriented, what they think about, what they measure, what they believe to be true, and what they're designed to do, I think the jury is still out, and that we need to see change in the scaffolding, if you will, that's keeping shareholder primacy in place. So a thought to explore with you today is, why do we grant business the license to operate? This is a license that's granted in the United States by individual states. But what also needs to be true to achieve what we call stakeholder capitalism? That's the language that the Business Roundtable chose. I don't personally really like the term stakeholder. We can talk about why maybe in conversation. But what needs to be true to achieve stakeholder capitalism in fact and in practice? So I'll just end this part of the introduction by saying I do think that we're in the early stages of what is a new era that is evolving in the business and the relationship between business and society. I do think the attitudes of business are changing, but there's more to understand. Which takes me to this more hopeful slide. I don't want you to think I'm anti-business. To the contrary, I'm a big believer in business. And again, as I started the conversation, I believe it's critically important in order for us to address issues of real consequence in our country and in the world. And luckily, we have many examples of companies that I believe are centered around a kind of human-centered design. They have an employee-centric culture. They are delivering real public goods, and they excel at transparency through the supply chain. That doesn't mean that every one of these companies that I have the logos on the screen don't have real trade-offs in which they engage. I personally don't believe that this is a win-win game. I don't think the company always does well by doing good. I think there are winners and losers, and that we're at a point in time where there are real consequences if we don't take action, and that there will be people that do better as a result and people who do worse. These companies are all motivated by different reasons. They have different legacies. Some of it is a family legacy, like in the case of Levi Strauss, that has been singular. Some of them had a real wake-up call, like Delta coming out of bankruptcy, where they realized they really needed to reward the employees if they were going to, in fact, be able to have planes that arrive on time and engage in real customer service that would restore their reputation. So there are many things to discuss about the motivation of corporations. But I want to take us back again. What is the value of a corporation today? It certainly can't be measured on the balance sheet. It's intangibles that are the source of real value. Things like reputation and trust. We can't talk about trust enough. Access to talent, retention, and access to natural resources. These words kind of flow out of our mouths a lot today, but I think they ask real questions about business continuity and the license to operate. When I graduated from business school in 1982, we talked about the values of companies and the inputs to the kind of critical inputs to a successful company as being a lot about financial capital. Access to financial capital loomed large. We certainly always talked about customers, and there was language around human capital. And of course, we were aware of the material inputs and the complexity of the supply chain. But I'd say that the conversation has shifted a lot, at least in boardrooms, if not in classrooms. Today, governance has become a major question. We spend a lot of time in the public domain talking about the governance of companies, which takes us back to the role of boards. Human capital has become, particularly during COVID, a critically important conversation. Ironically here, the piece that is actually least important is the financial capital. We are awash in capital. Capital is not a scarce resource. And so the question we might ask is why so much of our conversation and dialogue is about financial return, when in essence, public companies receive their capital at the IPO, at the time of their public offering, and the rest of the stock market is essentially a trading function between those who hold stock. It's not really of direct consequence to the company itself. Where it becomes consequential is when we reward executives tied back to the stock price. So I'd like to come back to that question. But first, I want to dive a little bit more into what's shifting in the nature of the conversation inside companies. What are these forces that are driving change? And if you read my book, and I hope you will, I'd love to hear back from you about what of this resonates in Colombia and in Latin America for you. I'm going to make 3 points. The first one that I think is critical is that responsibility of corporation has been and is in the process of being redefined. It is no longer defined by the company itself. When I graduated from college and I moved to Sacramento to work in state government in California, we used to say that the corporations have 2 responsibilities: create jobs and pay your taxes. I have to say, in the United States, we can't take either of those for granted today. And yet, it isn't that corporations don't have responsibilities. They are remarkably complex and are way outside, in many respects, of the control of the company itself. There are a host of NGOs that have learned and emboldened by social media and the support of media more generally, and the power of the internet. They are willing to harness the brand of an enterprise to make some kind of a larger point. I use the example of McDonald's because it's been targeted so many times by a host of different actions that have taken place over the period of decades. The very first campaign I remember against McDonald's was on their use of styrofoam. There was a morning in which McDonald's stores customers of McDonald's stores were greeted back in the 1970s by oversized chickens who were bearing the costs of the use of styrofoam. We may come back and say, well, that was a pretty easy problem to solve, but they knew how to target that industry, that particular actor, to make the larger point about the costs of using styrofoam. Today, the issues that McDonald's has been engaged in are, you can't count the number of times that McDonald's has been targeted. Today, they work in fisheries because they are the largest, or that their supply chain represents the largest producers of fish products and the kind of use of fisheries in the planet. And so they're heavily involved in sustainability of fisheries. And one of the bigger challenges they're facing today is actually the sustainability of beef, a product of course, all parts of North America and South America are heavily involved in the beef industry. And the issues that McDonald's is committing to when they say that they're going to produce sustainable beef are critically important on climate and on the health of of water systems and of planetary limits of all different kinds. And so it's an interesting reality that they have needed to get ahead of the curve and start to address questions before they land on the plate at McDonald's. The second thing that I think is shifting so massively is the voice of employees. And I'll be curious to see if this resonates as well. In the US, I have come to think of employees as the real key to corporate accountability. It's not really consumers. Consumers continue to rebound to price and convenience, as Amazon proves over and over. And it's not really about the investor. Investors come in all shapes and sizes. There are investors who are simply in and out of the stock in a matter of minutes. And of course, we have activists, but those activists have different aims. They're not all at the table because of a concern of environment or the health of the employee or labor conditions or the supply chain. Many of them are looking to try to make a quick buck or to try to figure out how to divide a company because they think it'll be more profitable for the current shareholder. So we're seeing very dynamic forces that are truly aligned, I believe, with the long-term health of society when we look through the lens of the employee. I might call it accountability in the cafeteria. We're employees back in the cafeteria yet in the company, and of course, more and more so they are. We're experiencing in the US what we call the Great Resignation. This is an effect of employees feeling they kind of lost their place at work, feeling disconnected, feeling stressed out from the responsibilities of managing home and life and work all from home. And we're seeing remarkable commitments by employees stepping up to do everything from using their own shares of stock to bring a shareholder resolution to the annual meeting around a company's commitment to climate, as we have seen at Amazon, to many more examples of employees engaging broadly in a host of different questions. And this list of issues that employees are concerned about only seems to grow. It's basically the measure of concerns that they have outside the gate with society generally, the concerns that they share as citizens. From the Me Too movement, which was advanced considerably by a walkout of employees at Google, to questions of identity that are being raised in industries like entertainment, and Netflix would be a good example of that. The bottom line is the game has simply changed, and that smart companies are starting to look at the protocols of engaging with employees to better understand the attitudes and understand the trends and the ways in which employee voice may actually help open up both risks and opportunities. Larry Culp, the CEO of GE, in announcing that he was breaking up the company into 3 pieces this last month, said the following. He said, increasingly, recruitment and retention of employees is more about the corporate whole. It's more than the corporate whole. It's about position and purpose. He said, there was once a point in time when people said, I want to work for GE. Today, people are more focused on addressing climate or being in healthcare or in aviation. I think, he said, going forward, what we are doing in recruiting and retention will be a function of what we are doing from a P&L situation. This is a little bit to parse. I almost want to send the language to you. But let me just say that his statement sticks with me for 2 reasons. One, he links corporate purpose to the P&L, to the profit and loss statement, where it belongs. The actual functioning of the company is what determines its real purpose. And to be realized in being more than words on a wall, the purpose of the company needs to powerfully connect to that business model. And secondly, Larry Culp calls out that employees are the organizing principle for the changes that we're beginning to see. And finally, let me point out this last this last kind of obvious question, that when the system is at risk, and increasingly we are facing existential risks to our collective survival, it's co-creation that becomes more important than competition. We're seeing this in climate, even with all of the companies that are stepping up and making what they call net zero commitments to reducing their own emissions, that we know that we don't arrive without collective will to change the rules of the road, to reprice carbon, to essentially change the incentives that continue to support fossil fuels. We know these are problems of real complexity. Unlike cruise lines, these are essential to our survival. Cruise lines we could probably do without and it wouldn't affect the economy. But we will need to rethink our sources of energy, which all of you know as well as I do. And so when we're addressing a problem as complicated and systemic as climate change, or go into the human domain, questions around inequality, which continues to grow in the United States, or the lack of economic mobility, you don't address these questions just one company at a time. We need to be working in consort and to be enabling networks to work together, to think in that terms of McDonald's, where you find the central figure, the central actor in a system that can unlock the entire supply chain, or even cases where companies work together, competitors work together to try to drive change and find the leverage point in a system that is not yet putting the health and the long-term value creation at the center. So we're asking some new questions, I believe. We're clearly focused more today on the business model. What are the real consequences of the business model? What are the consequences for employees? One of the reasons I don't like the word stakeholder is I don't think employees are just a stakeholder in a business. I think employees are the business. They are the window, as I said, into both risk and opportunity, but they're also the window into whether or not the company is engaging in fair transactions with their own employees. Economic mobility. The business model invites us to think about those who don't necessarily have a seat at the table and what their future looks like. And this question of a shared future around climate change. In the US and beyond, it's about democracy and the rule of law. So this brings us back to the question of business and whether or not and how business deploys its voice and power and to what ends. These are questions of business agency and business choice, but also business power. And the conversation in the United States today is very much about whether or not business is really leaning in on climate, or is holding back, or is working differently in Washington than it is when it's stating in the public domain what it cares about. Which brings me to some blind spots in this kind of conversation between intentions and reality. Here are some of the questions that we're asking when we get back to what the business model is actually doing and what we are enabling. These are questions that I think matter in boardrooms. How much does a company spend on tax avoidance? What's the purpose served by share buybacks in public companies? And under what conditions are they initiated? How do companies' lobbyists spend their time? I think this is a particularly American question, if you will, where money and politics are so closely intertwined. But it is a public question today, whether or not companies are in fact aligning their public power with their intentions. What story could be told about job creation and worker investment? This is going to be a critically important question in the next decade. What's the value of return to shareholders versus the return to the real value creators in the business? And finally, what is a CEO paid to do? In the US, in public companies, the weight of the pay package is 60, 70, 80, even 90% weighted in equity or equity equivalents. So we shouldn't be surprised that the CEO is mostly attuned to the share price, and that there are incentives and drivers and protocols and decision rules that still keep the shareholder at the center of the conversation. So how does the change take place? We think it happens at the top. The job of the CEO unquestionably has changed in the United States, particularly in these very visible public companies and those with large brands. They understand that they are leaders of the community, that he or she needs to understand the kind of entire enterprise as an ecosystem that needs to be managed. We know from our friends in the search business at Korn Ferry and other search that increasingly the CEO that they're seeking understands this nature of their job as a changed enterprise, and one that has to put the health of the entire enterprise at the center. We're seeing change from crisis. We talked about this already, systemic threats to commerce. That's what's essentially going on at McDonald's when they're being targeted on everything from the health of fisheries to the health of beef, food systems, natural resources, and the complexity of supply chains. We're seeing a lot of innovation from within. And a lot of our work in the Business and Society program is about supporting internal change agents within the business. I've given some examples of that, and I'd love to talk to you more or share with those of you who are interested in a fellowship program that we call the First Movers Fellowship. And we welcome, it's an international program, we welcome candidates from across businesses across the world who are engaging in the business model and helping drive change from within with the social or environmental purpose at its core. It's hard work, and building a cohort and helping people continue to build the courage of their convictions and figure out how to drive change from within a company is a special skill set that we think needs to be better understood. And finally, as we've talked about, we're seeing more change within industry and within business coalitions like the Business Roundtable. I want to end a little bit on business education, because I actually think the question of education, which we work in the Business and Society program, in some respects are the same questions that we need to explore in boardrooms. We work a lot in business schools, and we ask, what is the goal of business schools? I know a lot of you are involved in business education, certainly as recruiters, but as visitors, and also engaged in the organization that brings us together today, the Universidad de los Andes. You may serve on governing boards and in positions of influence. I think that there are parallels between these questions about what we want our students to learn, especially I would say in the study of finance, which tends to be more narrow and focus in on very unique measures of success. But also the broad question about what is the real impact of management education on the mindset of managers. If we consider the ecosystem in both, I'd say, classrooms as well as boardrooms, what will need to change? What's the next generation of management and finance professionals? What do they believe to be true? How will they measure business success? This is also true in boardrooms. Where is the role of firm-specific metrics versus an understanding of the health of society on which it depends? Where is the opportunity to actually challenge the growth paradigm? We, in fact, are on a collision course between the definition of GDP and planetary limits. And it takes me back to the mindset question, the mindset of managers and researchers. What skills will our managers require? In spite of the stereotypes about MBAs as being self-serving, or at least that's a stereotype in the United States, we know for a fact that the students who are seeking management education today are in part studying business at the graduate level because they want to learn how the real world works, how to diagnose problems, design solutions, motivate employees and teams, and kind of activate the supply chain and innovate and then measure results. To know how if you're on track and when you need to try something else. Employees have the same concerns as we all do, and they intuit, I believe, what we know from history and law and public policy, which is that corporations exist to create goods and services and to serve public needs, to do things that require more than the resources of an individual family or an individual or their family. Corporations exist at we offer the license, we the public offer the license to operate. We can't do without them. We don't appreciate them enough, I believe. But the skills we need to manage in a corporation today are going to require some different kind of capacities to address these problems of significance. The ability to work across functions and in coalition, we talked about. We need managers who have empathy for workers and the constituents that kind of are at the end of the chain, who bear the consequence of business decisions. We clearly need critical thinking and the understanding of systems. I believe we need moral courage to challenge conventions that are out of step with long-term value creation. And I think we need to understand sustainability as a mindset. Sustainability is not a destination, it's a way of thinking, which takes me to my last slide. I want to leave you with this thought. I live in New York City, just a couple of blocks from where the New York City Marathon runs through every year in early November. And I was there a couple of weeks ago watching not these women, but others who were running up First Avenue, and reminded me of a slogan on a t-shirt that I once saw on a runner in Central Park. The t-shirt said, "There is no finish line." And I want to leave us with this thought. Exactly, there is no finish line. The dance between business and society is a continuous kind of, well, I'm mixing metaphors, but it's a relay race. And it's a continuous relay race and one that will never end. We're seeing change happen, but we're also seeing signals of irreversible forces that I believe place us on a stronger footing than when I first started working in this domain some 25 and almost even 30 years ago. But there's no time to lose. We need business at the table to tackle unprecedented challenges that face our world. And with that, I guess I do have one more slide. I have a picture of my book, which I hope you'll all buy. And then I'll stop sharing and return the conversation to the moderator.
Thank you, Judy. So wonderful. And it's such a pleasure and an honor for us to have you here today, kicking off this cycle of Liga de Directores, where we wanted to put purpose at the center of the discussion of boards. And we wanted to ensure that we, as we always do in La Liga, put it in a way that really challenges our board members and executives that participate in La Liga. We want to ensure that the way that we tackle this topic is one that is not just kind of awash with good intentions and nice words, but that really goes to the core. And we believe that your work and your books have really gone to the core of this. So thank you so much for sharing your work and your knowledge with us. And thank you for talking today to Bernardo Vargas, who I will now introduce. Yesterday, you and Bernardo had the chance to have a conversation and to start kind of sharing ideas and thoughts on these topics. And to our group, Bernardo Vargas is very well known. Of course, he is the CEO of Grupo ISA, one of our most important multi-Latinas, born in Colombia, but present in many of our markets in Latin America. Bernardo has, in his time at ISA, I think, led a very important, I guess, transformation towards purpose, and I'd like him to tell us a little bit about this. But in his experience at ISA, first as a board member and then as CEO, I think he has had the chance to understand the ecosystem of our region and of the company, and be able to bring all the organization together around, you know, a very kind of clearly stated purpose: connections that inspire. Around that topic is that, you know, I would very much like you and Bernardo to talk to us, so that we can listen to your discussion around some of the issues that you discussed. I have a couple of questions, a couple of things that you mentioned in your lecture that I'd like to bring up. But first, I would like to invite Bernardo to share with us, you know, his experience at ISA, connections that inspire, and his reactions, you know, to these topics that I know are very close to his heart and that have been an inspiration for him also and his teams at ISA. Bernardo, welcome.
Good morning, Eulalia. Good morning, Judy. Good morning to all the participants. For me, I'm very honored to be part of this panel, which is amazing to have Judy there. Most of what I've heard of Judy across the years resonates to what we have been doing at ISA, which of course inspire us to do it even better. Because I completely believe in Judy's proposal that the race does not have a finish line, and that we're only starting in a process that will hopefully take us to the building through business of better communities and ultimately of a better society. Very briefly, because of course the protagonist today is Judy and not I will give you you know, when I arrived at ISA, which is a fantastic company, it had almost 50 years of very successful growth and very successful undertakings. But it was a very engineering-driven corporation in a world where risks were not based mostly on engineering any longer. And it had, you know, a very clear mission statement and vision statement that was put together by some very prominent consultant in the world. But when I got there and I walked around the corridors of the ISA, and I was asking people what they thought about the vision and mission statement, nobody really remembered. And so I understood there was a point, a blackout point where you could look at the main thing that should power corporations, as Judy mentioned, which is purpose. And as a result of that, we started to have a conversation with the people, with the employees, a bottom-up process, which is something that Judy mentioned, whereby employees were part of a discussion that came up to producing changes that started by the logo, which was a very engineering logo, but changed to the present logo, which is much more, let me express it this way, much more feminine, much closer to people, because the risks that we were facing were community risks, were environment risks, were risks that in essence could stop our business if we didn't engage in the right fashion with them. So we decided to move in that direction, and we were able to come up with this very simple 3-word purpose of connections that inspire. It was, I say again, it was not proposed by the CEO or the group of the top executives of the corporation. It was designed by conversations within the people, within the group, within the employees, so that it came up to resonate in something that they wanted. And a big challenge was to inspire. And so we did connections. So how about doing these connections in a way that inspired not only our employees, but you know, society in general? And that has really created an impact, because as Judy calls it, the voice of the employees is something that ISA has been doing since 2007 through an anonymous poll with all employees, with a participation of upwards of 95-96% of employees. And in that voice that they expressed through this poll We started at 72 over 100, which was average for Colombia and the region. And the last poll came out last week, we're at 86, 87, and the leadership aspect of that poll is close to 90. So it's 20 points, which is unprecedented for a corporation this size, in employees expressing that they're happy with what they're doing, that they're happy with what they're proposing to society, and they're working together, sort of rowing in the same direction. And around that, let me just refer to end to something that Eduardo Brown, which is an Argentinian writer, which is I really recommend, because he's been engaging with corporations for many years. He says that CEOs should be not chief executive officers, but chief emotions officers, to be able to engage with people in a way that everybody holds a conversation that is driven by what really motivates these people. And people are not necessarily only motivated by the results of the corporation they work in. They are engaged, as Judy very well underscores, by what happens in society, by the role that anybody can have in changing society and in being involved in the ecosystem, in being involved in climate change, in being involved in social endeavors to be able to make the people that have been suffering most and through the pandemic, that has been very clear, to be able to help them. Employees are engaged in serving, in being volunteers. So those kind of things have been very important in the process that we've done in ISA, in a way that's been very effective, because as soon as I arrived, we introduced joint reporting to make the statement that the financial part of the corporation could not be separated from the sustainability part. Second, we've been also engaging in all the international monitoring systems so that third parties will look at what we're doing. So we're with the Dow Jones, with the MILA indices, we're with many indices where third parties are showing if we're indeed going in the right directions of sustainability. And in that respect, it's been a million conversations that we're involved in. Just last month, in terms of gender participation, we got the silver medal by a measurement system designed by the Minister of Labor here in Colombia. It was our first measurement, and we're already silver medal. So that gender participation is very important. We have a program called Otras Miradas, other ways, other looks, so that we have people with disabilities working for our corporation. We also have innovation processes that have been very engaging and very fast moving. So a whole bunch of things where employees have been part of the conversation of how we can serve the society as a whole. And in that respect, let me end with this. How to do that? We've been driven by how to have conversations. It's so difficult in a world that's polarized, that has people that make it see it very difficult to share conversations with people that think differently from them. And we've been engaging with the people in how to converse, how to talk. We brought a fantastic Chilean philosopher and biologist called Humberto Maturana, which proposes the beauty of language and conversations. And he says that in order to have a good conversation, you have to let the other one appear. And that has been an inspirational point for all the conversations that we've had at ISA that have allowed us to build up towards what we've been able to develop, which is, as I mentioned before, a voice of the employees that's recognizing that we're a company that works towards a better society. And that's a bit of what I think Judy has been saying through his years of work.
Wonderful, Bernardo. And Judy, I'm curious to hear from listening to the ISA experience and Bernardo's leadership here. What are some of the aspects that strike you the most, and what are some of the things that perhaps are new and surprising to you?
Well, I think I'm immediately drawn to Bernardo's kind of description of the company and the things that were emerging that were critically important to the company's ability to function and flourish. The connections that go back to host communities. You're in businesses that have, environmental impacts. That has to be a shared kind of path to figure these things out, and employees are deeply concerned about them. So, that part immediately resonated for me. It takes me back to the question of corporate purpose, and I'm reminded of the experience of the executive of Merck, which I write about in the book. Roy Vagelos was the CEO into the 90s. And there was a moment in time where I had the opportunity to speak to him when I was still working for the Ford Foundation before I launched this program. And he really helped me. Speaking to him really helped the questions around corporate purpose to really crystallize for me, to really kind of come together. And it's because he was faced with a dilemma at a point in time about whether or not to proceed with manufacturing a drug that had no commercial value. The drug was called Mectistan. It had been, the drug discovery process had enabled a drug that did not end up, it was kind of what we call off-list benefit. It did not, in fact, achieve its aim, which was to address something around heart disease, but it ended up being a cure for the disease of river blindness, which is rampant in some river valleys in Africa and beyond. And he had to make the decision, since there would be no one who was affected by the drug who would have any ability to pay for it or access the drug. So delivering on the promise of the drug itself was going to require not only manufacturing a drug that they wouldn't be able to sell, but they would have to create kind of the infrastructure to deliver the drug to those who needed it and to sustain that over a long period of time. Well, river blindness is on the path to being eradicated in many places in which it is seen. Merck ultimately was called out by the United Nations as an extraordinary example of what was required. But what he understood is that for Merck to flourish, his scarce resource, if you will, the input that was absolutely critical to Merck over the long haul was the science and the scientist. And if he decided against manufacturing a drug that the scientist valued, that the scientist had created, and that the employees of Merck and the customers of Merck would understand as being critical to why the company existed. If he failed to kind of act on that, and he did act, and none of his management team thought it was a good idea to proceed. They saw this as an endless kind of hole of cost with no upside. But Merck continues to stay committed to the manufacture of Mectistan, and as I said, it's still being deployed in Africa with. But it spoke to why the company actually existed. He knew he didn't have a choice. He simply had to take that action. It takes me back to the question of purpose, because if purpose is something that's way over here that has nothing to do with how the company actually operates, we're missing something. And so what Bernardo's put on the table is how important these connections are to an enterprise that's in the businesses that Group ESA is in, and that ESA needs to land in order to still flourish and to enjoy the license to operate. And so I think these things have to be deeply connected.
Judy, and I think the Merck example and what Bernardo has been telling us about is quite to the heart of what you were saying, that the actual functioning of the company is the purpose. And I think that this is a development of other discussions of corporate social responsibility and corporate philanthropy, etc. I guess this has been coming in terms of development of the concept. But I'd be very curious, Bernardo, to hear also from you. When you arrived at ISA and you started, understanding that there was the need to bring up this storyline and to state this purpose, as you well said, in a way that was something that every employee, and hopefully also all of your stakeholders in general can replicate, that they know that is ISA's purpose. How was your process with your board, and what was the board's role in this? If you could share that with us here at Liga de Directores.
Well, I think that the board played a key role, and as Judy put forward beforehand, it's from the top that you have to move these processes. It's impossible to do it if you don't have board engagement, and if at the top of the corporation there's not a clear path as to what you need to do. I think that we articulated to our board what we needed to do. They thought it was the right thing, the right way to move, and they were completely engaged in supporting what we did, even though, of course, it forced us to be very explicit in what we were going to do, what the purpose was. And when you are dreaming of things, because what you do here is you state dreams, and you go to the board and say, I dream of things that haven't happened yet, and that are very, very testing in terms of whether you're able to do it or not, in terms of cultural transformation. And boards are better for many times for very objective and rational decisions, where I think the boards of the future need to change. They need to be open to these more decisions that have to do with dreams. And that's what our board was very, very instrumental in helping us do. And I think they understood that. And of course, looking back, many of the impossible dreams that we were articulating to the board now are true. And so dreams have to start to come out of rationality and start dreaming a little bit, be a little bit more, have a little bit more of the feminine side within them. And that's why women in boards are so important in order to understand this. But of course, there's challenges, because of course, ethics and transparency are a key aspect of any cultural change. Coherence is key, and to be able to express. I remember I have an anecdote which is fantastic. And our corporation ISA is mostly around engineering and engineers, and to dream many times is to inspire from the heart. And I remember the first time I spoke to them about being co-responsible and to think of love as an engine of change. They thought I was nuts. This CEO is talking to us engineers about love. We don't even talk about love in our home, And I think today, this is part of the conversations that these people have, that every one of us have at ISA, where love is a part of what we do as people that are serving society. And that's key in order to change culture. The biggest challenge for ISA in the future is to remain with a culture that interprets their role to society in a way that is constructive, that goes across the borders of ISA itself and resonates as an agent that, by its size, by its presence, is very important in this process that we need to do to change society, which, as Judy put it, is a race without an end game. It's a race that doesn't end. There's no finish line, as Judy said.
And Judy, you showed in your graphics how governance, you see governance taking a bigger and bigger space in this discussion of purpose. And as Bernardo was mentioning, that tone at the top and the support at the top for a CEO that has a vision and has a different way of doing things is critical. What do you see going on in the North American markets with regards to this at boards? You mentioned that there are challenges for boards right now. What do you see are the challenges? And then I'd love to hear from Bernardo what he sees in our markets are also the challenges for boards, because I think some are shared and some are different.
So one dynamic, boards are going through a lot of change. There is public companies in particular are under pressure to make sure that their boards are diverse by gender and race. And that in and of itself is, you have 9 people, or you have 11, or you have 13, or whatever the board is. And doing that is not that easy, but there are now listing standards. I mean, if you list on the NASDAQ, you have to have a woman on the board. That feels to me like a pretty low bar, one. If we want to actually have the kind of engagement that we need, or we're going to need more than one woman, because one woman is probably not likely to speak out. She does need to have compatriots on the board. So these things are incredibly complicated. I appreciate that. I think that boards, in some ways, and the other dynamism is that, we will be seeing a lot of people. We were talking about this yesterday. We're going to see a lot of board members leaving. So there will be room for new board members. So the process of redesigning boards is very much in play. But we'll be seeing a lot leaving, because I think that, we will have a lot of, just like we see the great resignation going on in other aspects of business, I think we'll see board members who have weathered, as many Zoom calls during COVID as they would like to handle, and that they're going to be ready to move on. And so I think we will see more of the baby boomers retiring and leaving room for a new generation to come onto boards, and that will be a good thing. But I think that I want to just call out one other thing, which we're thinking a lot about and believe is a domain of real complexity. And Bernardo talked about creating a report that spoke to some of the, the reports on the company's kind of social performance, if you will. That wasn't language he used, so I may not have captured it exactly right. But there's a real conversation going on in the US in public companies about metrics. What are we measuring? Who are we measuring it for? There is this growing conversation about so-called ESG, environment, society, governance. What does that actually mean? It's kind of a dialogue between investors and companies, but which investors? Who actually has the biggest voice? And where do boards sit in this? And in some ways, if I could wave a magic wand, and I don't get to, but if I could, the board would be kind of a bulwark for the executive, would enable the executive to take the kinds of risks and to consider the kinds of metrics that actually help the board and the executive know that they are making progress on a very limited number of important aims or important goals. I don't think every company is different. Every industry is different. I don't think companies can be everything to everybody. One of the reasons I don't like the language stakeholder is I don't think it's a management tool. It doesn't help the executive say, what is critically important to our long-term health, as Roy Vagelos did at Merck. It kind of ends up being this generic kind of, oh, we have to care about all of these things. And I think managers need real direction and need goals that are measurable, but, as Bernardo echoed, there is no finish line here. So we need to be alert to what management needs in order to continue to know that they are on the right path and are making real progress. Communicating that is partly what I believe boards need to be about, is understanding what those things are and helping the executive translate that. It's a full court press to deal with the complexity of investors in public markets, and clarity and taking that long-term view and staying with it and continuing to speak to the change that's happening is important. But it's not going to happen in a domain of metrics that are about rewarding and punishing companies, which is in essence what the ESG conversation is about. Most of these special green funds and these other things are mostly about either not investing in companies, we will not invest in companies that make, weapons, or we will not invest in companies that are in the tobacco industry, as opposed to supporting companies that are on the path. There is no, there's no right answers here. This is about trade-offs and complexity and taking a long-term view and staying flexible and continuing to invent where the company has a real stake in driving change over the long haul, where they need to collaborate with others, where employees are the best voice. And so I have this, I just reached out for it on my wall. I have this quote that I'll leave on the wall, and I'll just end my thoughts here on this. It's by a man named Jerry Muller, who wrote a book called The Tyranny of Metrics. And he writes that metrics lose their meaning when used to reward or punish performance rather than to diagnose and analyze. That's what the executive needs to do, right? The executive needs to be in a position to be hyper observant of the change and have a goal and know when they're on the path, but to be able to, just like we did back in the old quality movement of, a couple of decades ago, there was no finish line on quality. It was about employing, it was about listening to those who were on the factory floor, who could speak to when something is off kilter and needs an adjustment. And quality is a great word, like sustainability. It means something vaguely positive, but it has to be defined in place for it to have meaning in a particular enterprise. So this idea that the metrics need to help us constantly diagnose and analyze and see what's going on to stay on the path, I think this in fact is the work of boards.
And Bernardo, how do you react to that?
Well, I think that the concept of ESG works if it's a part and parcel of what a corporation means. So financial returns plus everything that is about ESG, and there are metrics that have to be tied to compensation, not only in terms of EBITDA, but in terms of ESG processes. And this allows corporations and boards and executives to think through the processes and be able to decide whether the direction of a corporation's presence in society is going in the right fashion. So that's where metrics in there are important. But metrics in general that have to do with the well-being of society in general, not only of the corporation itself. So that's very important. And also, let me say that what you do now as a corporation, if you do well, if you protect society, is not necessarily going to be good for you in the short term. In our experience, it has been good when big trouble comes, when we need to have big challenges in front of us, where our constituents, the communities that we deal with, our employees, deal with the problems that the corporation is facing in an empathic way, helping us delve through. I have a great example. We have been doing many work across the Sierra Nevada and Santa Marta, where there are indigenous communities that are very belligerent to big business. But to us, they are our friends. They're empathetic to us. We worked with them, but not because they like us today, but because we've been working with them for 15 years, where we have been building confidence together for many years. And this is where corporations need to envision how doing right, doing well pays off. It's a long, it's a marathon. It's not and a 100-meter dash. It's a marathon. You have to be prepared for that. But the discourse, the storytelling has to be coherent. It has to be clear in a way to create confidence. And I think that creating confidence is fundamental. We have also used a symbol, which is fantastic. Our environmental program is called Conexión Jaguar, Connection Jaguar. And we use the face of this fantastic feline to send the message of what we're doing at ISA to protect the environment. And using the symbol of the jaguar has been an amazing tool to communicate to communities, to communicate to people. So corporations need to use, what in business is called soft language more and more, because this is the best way to bring forward a message that is better understood, better digested by communities that are much more engaged, much more connected, much more educated, and that will be either your biggest enemies or your biggest allies in moments of truth.
Can I just react for 1 second and say, I love the fact that you drew out the word processes. That's essentially what the quality movement was about, right? It was about the processes that lead us to continuous improvement and to the aiming at the notion of real quality. Today, quality is no longer just a function of what happens on the factory floor. It's about what's happening deep in a very complex global supply chain. It's about these incredibly complicated relationships like the one you just spoke about. So I think processes and relationships, these connections, and they're both about connections, that's the real work. So I love that what you were talking about.
Wonderful. And Bernardo, as a final question that I'll pose, and I'll ask our audience to share questions if you'd like through the chat. You can write them in English and Spanish, however you prefer, and we'll be asking them of Judy and Bernardo. But as some of the audience questions come in, Bernardo, you have the experience of being both, a CEO of a leading multi-Latina corporation, but also you've sat on many different boards, including ISA's before you became CEO. What do you think are, in this context, some of the challenges for boards in Latin America in general? Judy mentioned some of the challenges in the developed markets, very related to diversity and also a succession, a change in boards right now. Do you see some additional topics that are quite important in boards?
Very, very much so, Eulalia, because Latin America, as opposed to the US, is a part of the world where publicly listed companies are scarce. There's very few participation in terms of when you compare it perhaps to the US or Europe. And in that respect, corporations in Latin America are privately held, many family-owned corporations, and many small corporations. And in that respect, the communication between the enterprises and society and communities has not been very good. As a matter of fact, if you look at polls in Peru or Chile, the way corporations come out is very low in terms of how communities, how society perceives the role of corporations in their lives. And that's something that is a huge challenge for CEOs, for boards, in order to pass through the message that corporations are a part of the problem and not a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. And that's something that when you're publicly listed, it's easier to do because there's so many people looking at you where you're not. When you're privately held, that's a conversation to pass through to societies that's difficult, much more difficult to do. And I think that's a huge challenge of boards and of corporations. But also, having said that, the other important part is you can't pass the right message if you don't do the right, if you don't do good, if you don't set example. I think that leadership is guided by example, and corporations, if they want to lead societies, they need to lead it through example of being ethical, of being transparent, of doing what they say, put their actions where their mouth is, and be very clear in a race that is a long-term race of building confidence. And that, I think, is a challenge in Latin America that, as I said before, has to be communicated better to communities across the region.
And listening to both of you earlier, I was thinking of something that I hadn't thought about before. In many occasions when we work with boards, I get this comment from board members. Well, I'm not an expert in this business on the board that I sit on. The expert is the CEO and his or her team, and board members have diverse expertise that they bring to the table. And sometimes I hear that opinion from board members in a sense of saying, I can bring the best of my knowledge here, but I'm not an expert in this particular business. But Judy earlier was saying something that is quite important. It has to do with this view of purpose being linked to understanding the ecosystem that the corporation functions in and is a part of, and it can be a part of the crux of. And in that sense, then one of the board roles that I see there is to be that kind of help to bring that voice of that ecosystem, the risks and opportunities of that ecosystem to the table, to the discussion. And in that sense, then of course that diversity is particularly important of views to ensure that you're looking at all the different aspects of the ecosystem to be able to support the CEO and the executive team in navigating purpose in that ecosystem. Do you think that that's a fair way to look at the board's role in purpose, Judy, Bernardo?
I certainly do. I assume Bernardo agrees as well, but I let him speak for himself. But I would say that, it takes us back to this question of trust. You said that trust in business is low. Well, trust in business is low in the United States too, even though there's a lot of data that says business is the most trusted institution in the US. We like private initiative in the United States. We're not such a big fan of government, let's be clear. But of course, that cuts across all kinds of different political divides. But the fact is that trust in business is like one fraction ahead of trust in government. And it's low in, trust in both is low, which takes us back to what's the role, what needs to be true in order to restore trust? And that has to be about authentic, about being truthful, right? About saying we're not doing it all right. About getting away from these reports that are saying how great we are, and also talking about the challenges and the trade-offs and where the company is going to have to, negotiate, where there's boundaries that are, impinging on the health of the enterprise in ways that are going to hurt the financial results. As I said, we're focused mostly on public companies. So maybe this is less true for private firms, but the public markets do not reward investments made by the enterprise that rebound to employees or rebound to, the environment. If you raise the rate, when Walmart raised the intention about their wages from $12 an hour to $15 an hour to keep pace with Amazon, ironically, the stock price went down. It didn't go up. That is a reality. Companies need to be able to kind of weather those kinds of decisions, knowing that not everybody benefits by every conversation and that it's all about taking a long-term view. So I think restoring trust really requires putting the health of society at the center and being clear about those kinds of trade-offs and consequences, and that we are on a journey and that the intentions are there and we're managing for a better result, but not over-promising because over-promising leads to saying at a superficial level. You know, it doesn't allow us to kind of go back deep into the business model and making sure we have the right alignment. So, sorry, that was a long response to a simple question, but that and leading by example, I think what Bernardo said about that is also critically important. I think business learns from one another. It is inspired by companies that take bold steps.
Well, in that respect, the ISA story is unlikely, because in my watch, the stock price has multiplied by more than 4 times. And I wouldn't say that that's as a result of only our financial prowess or the way that we've grown. I think it has to do with the fact that we've been able to pass on a message of society engagement, of doing good that entices shareholders to buy our stock. And that's something that I haven't measured it, but I think that it has to be part and parcel of that amazing growth for a corporation this size. And I think that that's how us at ISA, our boards, our employees, my partners here, represent what we're trying to do, because we think we can't do one thing without the other. And if we believe that and we do it right and we do not it's interesting what Judy says, because when you're dreaming of things, are you over-promising? That's a big question. If you dream of a cultural transformation in a corporation, are you over-promising? What if you don't meet those dreams? But it's part of the challenges that I think CEOs and boards have. And I think, as I said before, the soft aspect of board engagement and CEO engagement going forward is key in something that Judy underscored, which is a human-centric design. I think more and more our conversations have to be centered around humanity, which is what we're all about. Judy said it, corporations are nothing. Corporations are groups of people working together, and that's human beings doing it. And I think that's part of the big challenge that we have going forward. How are we as corporations going to build a more human society? A more humane, let me say it, to speak better English.
Both work.
Wonderful. Let's open the floor to our audience. We're happy to take your questions via chat, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand. I'll ask the team of Los Andes to activate the speakers in order, because I can't see them from here from my screen. So questions from our audience.
That's funny. Colombians are not shy at all, Judy.
Maybe this is a topic that is making everyone think very, very much. And I still have a couple more questions if you'd like. Oh, here we have one. So we're getting a question from Sol Beatriz Arango, Judy, and Bernardo. And the question is, what is your vision about alliances or partnerships that corporations need to take on to be able to achieve the purposes that have to do with society and the planet? How much of activists should companies be, should corporations be?
Do you want me to respond? I'd love to hear what Bernardo has to say about this as well, but I'll offer an example of one that I think is really interesting and unusual, but very timely. There's a coalition that has emerged that is kind of aligned with the Business Roundtable, but it's separate. It's led by Ginny Rometty, who was then the CEO of IBM, and the CEOs of actually Merck and the former CEO of American Express, Ken Chenault and Ken Fraser at Merck. And they call it 110. I can't remember what the 1 stands for, but the 10 stands for a commitment to create 10 million jobs for Black employees, for African American employees. And I'm reminded what Bernardo was saying about, dreams, and are dreams dangerous? Well, this is a bold dream, but of course, executing against something like that is where it's all about, right? And you can't execute against something that bold without bringing a coalition together. And then you have to be saying, what are the barriers to achieving it? Like, how will we go about it? And what are the barriers? And one of the barriers that this coalition is now working on is actually going back and scrubbing job descriptions, going back and examining job descriptions and saying, do we actually require college degrees to really do the job? Or in some cases, are college degrees getting in the way of opening up employment to a broader section of society? That is within the control. I love this one because it's fully within the control of the executive. We don't need a regulation. We need the power of example, to Bernardo's, to what he was talking about. When a company does something like that, everybody can copy it, and everybody does copy it. So, and knowing the brands that sit behind this commitment, you know that they will stay at it because it's too, in some respects, it's too bold to ignore, but it's too measurable to not know whether or not you're on track and you're actually making the kind of progress that's needed. And so I think it's a great example. There, you think about any endeavor that's large, you know, anything that's larger than something you can accomplish. If you can't make it happen through your own supply chain, where you do have real leverage, we're talking about coalitions and building coalitions. And I do think that business trusts one another, even if this society doesn't broadly, trust business. And there's a lot more that can be done along the lines of that example.
Yeah, I believe very much in alliances, as Judy says. As a matter of fact, our strategy to 2030 is defined by the words vida in Spanish, VIDA, V as verde, I innovation, de desarrollo, A alliances, or in English, giga as giga growth, innovation, green innovation, growth, and alliances. I think that in the future, doing work with others is key to what corporations have to do. As a matter of fact, when we design processes that impact society and the environment or social processes, some executive at one point at ISA said, let's do it ourselves because others will copy it. And I said, I hope they copy it. It's the best way to have others do, as Judy just put it, do good. And so I really believe that. And in terms of so Beatrice's question, how activists corporations have to be, I think more and more, in order to put forward the message that we're part of the solution and not of the problem.
Wonderful. And there's a question from Hugo Posada on incentives. And so Hugo asks, from an incentives point of view, any guidelines or examples of how boards and executives, and not only the C-level, are being nudged towards promoting and executing ESG targets versus financial operational? I think both of you might have very good views on this.
No, I think that it's up to Kearney to give us the right answer, because C-level compensation and incentives is something that I can talk about, but Hugo puts forward a very interesting question about board compensation in terms of ESG alternative targets. So that's something that we're not expert in at ISA, and I think that Kearney can give the right answer. But I don't know if Judy has something to say about this.
I do. I put something in chat that I would recommend you take a look at. Again, it may feel geared to public companies more than private companies. I actually haven't looked at it with that lens, and I'd love to know what you think about it. But it was essentially an opportunity to step back and say, what's the structure of pay that works? And the US is known for crazy CEO pay, so I don't want to hold us up as an example. I want to hold up the process we went through as an example of what we think needs to happen in order to structure CEO pay to make common sense. And for it to make common sense, the CEO's pay has to have the proper relationship to the enterprise, not just to the stock market. And that's one kind of key element of this. your member is asked specifically about ESG kind of metrics, and that is a very hot topic right now in boardrooms and in this whole kind of question of investors. But it takes us back to this conundrum of metrics. Like, what do you actually need to incentivize a CEO to do? And what should be considered, as we call, table stakes? Where should, I'm sure Bernardo has thoughts on this, where do we actually need to reward an executive for doing things that are sensible in terms of the health of the enterprise and in the health of society? On the other hand, calling out some goals, and I will use the example of Shell Oil, because they were the first company that I was aware of that actually built goals around reduction of carbon emissions into the CEO's pay package, and that by design then, I believe, has influenced the pay of other leaders within the enterprise. So by them putting out there and saying this represents 10% of the CEO's compensation, I think is a very strong signal. On the other hand, you would find critics that say 10%. This is an existential crisis. We need more than 10% of the attention of the CEO on climate change. So, you open yourself to criticism, but I think that the act of putting something into the pay package can be a critically important thing to do. The challenge is not to overwhelm pay with a bunch of things that are maybe measurable. Whether they work as incentives, I think is questionable. We know a lot about behavioral economics and behavioral science, and we know that executives have jobs of judgment. They are not piece workers. Where incentives really work is on the factory floor. When somebody's doing a repetitive task, we know that incentives can actually help them work faster, if that's what the goal is. Do they help them work more carefully? You can design an incentive to make sure that they work more carefully. When you're talking about an executive, incentives can have unintended consequences, and we need to be very careful about anything that we put into the pay package, that we're not either rewarding something that should be expected of a leader, or over designing pay so that we're not abundantly clear about what constitutes long-term success. So that may have sounded very jumbled and complex. It is. And I do suggest you take a look at these pay principles that we did in partnership with the search firm Korn Ferry. And I think they open up very interesting questions about the right relationship between the CEO's pay and the health of the enterprise overall.
And I think that Hugo's question is particularly relevant to our Latin American markets, because I think that CEO pay is perhaps structured a little bit differently. And certainly board compensation is structured in a very, very different way and in a different magnitude than in the North American markets. But I think this discussion opens an interesting topic to look at in our Center for Corporate Governance at Universidad de los Andes, because, as you were expressing on the topic of purpose, and of course, all of the ESG factors link to a specific purpose and to the specific way that a company does things, and what it is that the company focuses on. But that could also be an interesting avenue to look at, how boards add value towards taking the company forward in purpose. We have a question for Judith from Isaac Janovich. What are the most recent practices on board compensation? He was really on that topic.
Well, I do think we're not seeing any real change in terms of the stratospheric compensation of U.S. public company executives. And a lot of that is because it is tied to the stock price. But, you know, I think middle managers and below pay has been growing at about 3%. You know, there was a little bit of an uptick during COVID, but, you know, a lot of companies that were rewarding frontline workers stopped doing it after the kind of, you know, the most tense days during the epidemic, where they wanted to make sure that people were showing up to work. And so we've got a long ways to go, because the CEO's pay would suggest that, you know, it's like paying the airline by only paying the pilot, you know, that it doesn't matter who else is on the plane, managing the customers or the grounds crew or the engineers or the people that actually keep the plane afloat. It's as if you're rewarding one person, and that becomes symbolic of the enterprise. And of course, we know that that's not the case. You need to have the right relationship between the CEO and his or her direct reports. That has to be relatable. There is research that suggests that if the CEO is paid more than 2.5, if anybody is paid 2.5 times more than their direct reports, that you start to see some rupture in trust and you know, and teamwork. And so we know what we need to do, but you've got the problem of the executives are uncomfortable with departing from, you know, their cohort because of connected boards and all of these other practices. It's a very complicated question to unwind. So we're still looking for courageous companies and boards and CEOs. And we think that we'll see them with some of the new companies that are being created, who may decide to reward their executive differently. And so we're keeping an eye on that as well. But I think the recent practices, this question about what else do you reward the executive for, as Bernardo said, besides EBITDA and you know, and equity related compensation, what does that look like, and how do you do that thoughtfully? We don't have all the answers. We've got a lot of questions, but I do think that you're starting to see boards, you know, take this on much more seriously, and investors.
No, and I, if I may, you know, I truly believe in Judy's vision of being at the early stage of a new era. I truly believe that Judy is right in that respect. And I think that the new era will be of corporations that are able to reward soft practices, because they will be key to stock price enhancement, because society in general will perceive that as things that are necessary for them to be either customers of these corporations or participate in it as shareholders. So I think that the new era is coming, and I have a vision of that being whereby employee and board compensation has to be tied with things that are today considered more soft.
Wonderful. And we have one final question from Javier Jaramillo, kind of coming at the topic from another way. And he asks, how can portfolio managers, so pension funds and funds who are managing, you know, others' money, how can they balance their need to ensure financial returns with other aspects that are important with regards to purpose and ESG? So from that perspective, those are other types of companies. Those are other corporations, pension funds and funds. How do they look at this topic? What do you think, Judith?
That's too hard a question. You know, it's we know that you know, if you're a large financial institution, you know, asset manager, intermediary, and you're holding a significant part of the market like an index fund does, you know, what are you actually going to do? You know, you pick and choose a few battles to raise, but you can't sell the stock as an indexer. You can't sell the stock truly. You can craft some funds that in name may speak to some part of the portfolio, and we're seeing that happen a lot more. But the problems of that are pretty rife. And mutual funds, I think their management style in the U.S. has been to essentially outsource their responsibility as a shareholder to entities like ISS and Glass Lewis that are advising, are in the middle. They're both advising companies and making money off of companies who want some assurance from them or advice from them to make sure that they don't become targets. These entities then become kind of arbiters of standard that are put shareholders absolutely at the center. So it's another one of these pieces of the scaffolding that's keeping shareholder primacy in place. So I think we need to be taking more we need to be looking more to smaller funds that have more bespoke portfolios and that have the time to engage directly with companies if we're really going to mirror the kinds of practices that make a real difference. I do think that's why I don't have a lot of faith in customers leading us out of these questions. I think employees are a better place to put your time and effort, because I think this is the ultimate in magical thinking. Investors want it both ways. They want the stock price to always go up. They want their portfolio always to be worth something more tomorrow. And they don't want Amazon as part of the portfolio because they think that they're a bad actor, but they want the return that Amazon gives them and they want to keep buying from Amazon. That's the customer. So good luck being a mutual fund.
But let me, if I may, have a contrasting view on that, because
good.
I think 35%
is too dark.
35% of the shareholder community that owns these stocks are pension funds. And when we have feedback conversations with them, both local and international, the conversation has to do many times, a lot with what we're doing in terms of sustainability and ESG. So that's the first statement. Second is big investors in the world like BlackRock are being very important in understanding that this is early stage of a new era, as Judy puts it. So I think it's early stage, but we're going in the right direction. And the third aspect is, in the past 2 years and a half, ESA has financed itself in the international financial markets with almost $2+ billion in green financing, with better rates, with better alternatives, with longer tenors. And in that respect, Lena's question as to how to value intangibles is there. If you do it right, if you do green, you get better prices. And that, of course, enhances your stock price ultimately. So I think that that's being incorporated into the value of your share price more and more, and allows for corporations to be able to engage more and more in being present to construct better societies. So I think it's going there. We're early stage, but we're going in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for this, very lively conversation. It's really wonderful to have, two such important actors in the, the thinking, the research world around this topic, and Bernardo, with, the wonderful job that you have done at ESA to be able to share, these thoughts and the practice. We are, so grateful for your time, and we would like to very briefly share with all of you what our 2 moments of Liga de Directores are going to be in 2022, building on this process and this topic of purpose and transforming towards purpose from the board, which brings us together. So I'll pass it over to Oscar, and again, Judy, Bernardo, thank you so much for your time. Please, Oscar.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Bernardo. And please let me change the language to Spanish in order to our audience. Como dice Eulalia, es muy importante. Dice Eulalia, es muy importante. Tengo redundancia en el hablado. Tenemos 2 fechas muy importantes el próximo semestre, el 19 y el 21 de abril. dos fechas que son combinadas, como recuerdo Beneta al inicio explicó. La primera es una sesión virtual en donde vamos a tener unas dinámicas de transformación, de retos de transformación hacia el futuro en nuestras juntas directivas. Y el 21 vamos a tener una sesión presencial, pero aquellos que no se puedan conectar lo podrán hacer virtual, en donde vamos a hablar de cambio climático, transformaciones energéticas, en donde vamos a estar trabajando en temas de paneles, pero también en temas de trabajo en equipo con ustedes. Esas dos fechas son muy importantes, 19 de abril, 21 de abril. Luego, en continuidad con este proceso, vamos a tener otras dos fechas. El 16 de agosto, ¿cierto? Y el 18 de agosto en esta misma secuencia. 16 virtual y 18 presencial. Y vamos a tener el trabajo de modelos de negocios en rentabilidad y ESG. Y el día 4, que es el 18 de agosto, vamos a tener el trabajo presencial en talleres sobre el plan de acción para transformar con propósito. Creemos que esta nueva modalidad de la Liga de Directores va a ser muy rica en experiencias, en trabajo conjunto. Por lo tanto, les pedimos que reserven esas fechas desde ya para que podamos tener un éxito importante en nuestras sesiones del próximo año. Gracias.
Excelente, Oscar. Mil y mil gracias. Y para todos y todas, muchísimas gracias por su presencia hoy. Estaremos entonces en contacto para que reserven sus fechas de la Liga de Directores y para que continuemos la conversación. Muchas gracias por las intervenciones y de nuevo, Judith, Bernardo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thank
day.
you so much for having me. And I enjoyed it very much and working with Bernardo and the whole team. Thank you so much, Lilia. Thank you very much for having us, Vanessa, too. Oscar, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you,
Have a great
Judy.
day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Everybody have a great
Bernardo.
day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.